Hey everybody, I'm Chris Norman, also known as Nose, co-author of the GURPS Game Aid for Foundry, and this is the next video in the Learning GURPS series, Adventures. Okay, so you've decided to run GURPS, but when you go look for an adventure, there doesn't seem to be a lot out there. That's one of the main disadvantages of having such a configurable gaming system. Adventure authors have a difficult time creating a scenario that works in your version of GURPS. You might be creating a straight fantasy world, but you may also want to add modern technology, or superpowers, or, well, you get the picture. There are some adventures created for the Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game, which is GURPS for the fantasy genre, which my current group is playing through. Thanks, Douglas. But otherwise, you're on your own. So either you create your own adventure, or you can adapt an adventure to work in GURPS. An adventure is basically made up of two things, the story and the mechanics. The story you can reuse. You just need to adjust the mechanics to fit GURPS, which basically means you need to create the NPCs in GURPS. In my NPC video, I talk about how to create NPCs quickly and discuss that scaling NPCs comes with experience, but I want to expand upon that here. First, I want to discuss the relative power of your characters. In a gaming system like Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder, the power level goes up sort of like this, with major leaps every time you go up a level. In the Dungeon Fantasy RPG, the relative power of your characters looks more like this. Well, what does that mean for you? Let's say you create a low-level NPC for D&D, which may be here. And then you try to use it in a higher-level combat, except that it just won't be effective. Or worse yet, you designed a higher-level NPC for later in the adventure and try to use it earlier. It'd be a TPK. But since the power graph is flatter in GURPS, if you happen to overshoot or undershoot your target, it doesn't take much to adjust your NPC to fit your current party. And this is a useful fact if you happen to run the same adventure for different groups of players. Since the player is allowed to build or grow their character as they will, with the GM's permission, of course, you may have one group that focuses on combat, while another group focuses on social skills, and combat is just a means to an end. If this happens, you'll want to slide the NPCs a little up or down the power graph to fit the power of the current group. For example, I've been adapting the old D&D adventure A Night Below for a low-power GURPS setting, 150-point starting characters. One of the first encounters is with a group of brigands with an archer or two that try to waylay the party. So I created a brigand character based on the sample player characters that I was creating. The player characters had attack skills around 14, so I set the brigands' attack skills to 12. The brigands had about 3/4 the hit points that the player characters had, and the weapons all did 1 or 2 points less damage. So if the player character's weapons were doing 1d plus 1, the brigand's weapons would do 1d or 1d minus 1. The plan was to have 1 or 2 more brigands than player characters, which is why I lowered the values of the brigands as much as I did. Of course, these values would be different if we were starting with a Dungeon Fantasy RPG character, which starts around 250 points, but you follow the same guidelines. All you're trying to do is recreate the essence of the NPC for that particular part of the adventure. In this case, it was just some thugs with low-quality or makeshift weapons, desperately trying to waylay the party. But later in the adventure, it may be some mind flayers that have some kind of psionic power that can damage or stun. And following my NPC advice, you watched the NPC video, right? You could just write down some traits that sound like they would fit the concept of a mind flayer. Maybe something like roll versus willpower or take mental damage, which is a combination of hit points and fatigue points at the same time. And here you can be creative. When I discussed the power graph on the GURPS Discord, it was pointed out that this chart really only works for the Dungeon Fantasy RPG or fantasy setting versus D&D and Pathfinder. It's more of an apples-to-apples comparison. If you try to compare a D&D character to a GURPS superhero character, or a modern combat character, well, that really becomes an apples to oranges comparison, and it might be subject of a different video, but not here. Okay, hopefully that doesn't sound too hard. As your player characters advance the NPCs they encounter. After 1 or 2 battles, you will start to get a feel of how well the players are able to handle the NPCs and the relative importance of the various values of hit points, attack skill, damage resistance, etc. But remember, just as GURPS is highly configurable, so too are your player characters. Your players may build suboptimal fighters. That may not be their primary goal, but they still want to go through this adventure. So you have 2 options. Try to maintain the original power level of the adventure, in which case your partner might just get slaughtered, or you adapt the adventure to your players. You have to remember that it isn't the players versus the GM. Matthew Colville, in his Running the Game video series, reminded me of this. The GM and the players are working together to create a story. It's the GM's job to provide something challenging, not undefeatable. By the way, if you haven't watched his series, I highly recommend it. Most of the videos are system agnostic, so they apply to any role-playing game. You're most likely playing with your friends, and who doesn't remember that great battle where you vanquish the foes at the very last minute to save the town from extinction, or insert your own trope here. But that's the most fun, when the GM can challenge the players and the players can overcome. It's no fun if it's not a challenge, and it's really no fun if the challenge is impossible. So getting back to adapting an adventure. My advice is to only prepare the NPCs up to a point. Your players are only going to get to so many NPCs in a single session, so there's no reason to work out the NPCs for the whole rest of the adventure. Create what you reasonably need in the near future and trust that you can create the later NPCs later. Remember, your player characters will be evolving during this time, and they may be more interested in non-combat skills for a different portion of the adventure, so you don't really know how their various power levels will go up. It's completely understandable if your spellcaster decides to learn a whole bunch of knowledge spells instead of combat spells. Maybe that's their character arc. But that means that their relative combat power really didn't go up, so maybe the NPC's power levels wouldn't go up either. But who cares? The juice, as Matthew Colville puts it, is in the gameplay, the interaction between the players and the GM, solving a puzzle or overcoming an obstacle. Does it really matter if the brigand for your adventure isn't the same power as the original? The answer, of course, is no. Finally, when building your adventure, you might want to consider some things. Players may have built their character from scratch, and this could take a while. My current character, Grend, was built over many nights in a 2-week period. Of course, you may also have players that ask you to build it for them, and this is completely reasonable. But the point is, character creation takes some time. And your players who do may become really attached to their characters. Grend. GURPS combat is arguably more lethal, especially for smaller parties. See my combat video. Given all that, a TPK, a total party kill, may have a bigger effect on your players. When you can just roll up a new character in 10 or 15 minutes, creating a new one isn't a hardship. But if they spent 2 weeks designing their favorite druid, and they're slaughtered in the first 10 minutes, someone's going to be unhappy. Fortunately, that didn't happen. So as the GM, I just want you to keep in mind some mitigating factors. I use a home rule that if the player character's hit points drop below negative their health, instead of rolling to see if they die, I have them roll to see if they go into a deep coma. Somebody in that state cannot be magically healed back to full health and rejoin the battle. They are effectively out. It means they need long-term care to come back to full. But so long as the party survives, they can still play their character. Or maybe you could allow magical healing to bring them back to some kind of partial health. Maybe limit their max hit points to 1/3 and their fatigue points to 1/2. The player gets to keep their character and still feel the punishment of losing the combat. Another factor you might consider is removing critical hits for NPCs. In my humble opinion, the biggest issue with critical hits is that the target doesn't get a chance to roll a defense. And if the NPC, say, was targeting the eye with a dagger, well, your player character is skewered. Just like NPCs don't need to be able to use extra effort, they don't need to be able to crit. As I said in the NPC video, they aren't the heroes, your player characters are. Maybe you disallow NPC crits in your first few battles, until you and your players get the feel of GURPS combat, and then add them back in. It'll definitely be a surprise. And a final thing to consider is what would happen if they do fail in the combat. In the first encounter in the Night Below adventure, and I'm sorry, this is a small spoiler, if the party of level 1 characters, for some reason, are unable to vanquish the brigands, then one of the NPCs that you learn about later will come in and finish the battle. The player characters wake up to see the brigands slaughtered or trussed up, and one of the characters catches a glimpse of the elusive druid as they slip back into the trees. Of course, that's one way of handling it. Matthew Colville has a video about intelligent monsters. They may bargain with you to collect your dead in exchange for money or treasure. Or think outside the box and have them adventure in the spirit world to find a benevolent power that can restore them to life. Of course, the options are endless. I just want you to keep this in the back of your head because, as I alluded to earlier, a TPK is a bit more costly in GURPS because of the character creation time. Hopefully you can see that the lack of pre-made adventures for GURPS isn't the huge detriment that you might have thought, because there are thousands of stories out there that you can reuse from any genre, and you just have to build the NPCs, which really isn't that hard. Trust me, you will get better at it. And as always, thank you for watching.